The call came in at 11:47 on a Tuesday morning, and I heard it through the floor. I was 2 levels up, pulling new conduit through a drop ceiling on the 3rd floor of a downtown tech firm called Hale Systems. 3 days into a 5-day rewire job. The building was 11 stories of glass and brushed steel, and the basement level, server rooms, mechanical, a secondary operations center, had been retrofitted twice in the last decade. I knew that because I'd read the original electrical schematics the day before, which meant I'd also looked at the structural drawings long enough to notice the load path changes the retrofits had introduced. Old habit. I've never been able to look at a building without reading it the way other people read a page. The concussion came first. A low, chest-deep thud I felt more than heard. Then the building shook, just once, the way a dog shakes off water. Tools slid off my work tray. A ceiling tile dropped. Then the alarms. I was already moving toward the stairwell when the second sound came, not an explosion, more like a long exhalation, the groan of concrete finding a new position. I knew that sound. I'd heard it in places I don't talk about much anymore. By the time I reached the lobby, the evacuation was underway. The building's facilities manager, a man named Carl, was at the front doors with a clipboard, counting heads. I asked him what level the collapse was on. He stared at me like I'd spoken a foreign language. I asked again. He said basement 2. I walked outside and stood on the sidewalk and looked at the building's profile the way you look at a person's face when you're trying to read what they aren't saying. The fire crews arrived in 4 minutes. They were good, organized, calm, no wasted motion. The incident commander, Captain Rourke, set up on the north side where the grade gave him a sight line to the basement ventilation grates. His team pulled a schematic from the facilities office and spread it on the hood of a truck. I drifted close enough to see it. Gas line rupture in the mechanical room, sub-basement. The rupture had blown a lateral support out of position, and the northeast corner of basement 2 had folded, a partial pancake, one slab sitting on another at a 20-degree tilt. 3 people unaccounted for. The CEO, Margot Hale, I'd seen her twice that week, sharp woman in a gray blazer who moved like she had 17 things happening at once, her operations director, a man named Tran, and a young analyst named Keeley who'd been pulling server logs in the secondary ops center when it went. I could hear voices from the grate. Muffled, but there. All 3 alive. Rourke's technical rescue team went to the northeast access point and came back in 6 minutes. The team lead, a 20-year veteran named Briscoe, spoke quietly to Rourke with his hands moving, showing the geometry. I watched Briscoe's hands. I knew what he was describing before he finished. The collapse had created a survivable void, but the secondary shear risk, a remaining wall section sitting on a cracked transfer beam, made the approach unpredictable. If that beam shifted while someone was inside, the whole northeast quadrant could drop another 4 feet. Briscoe was right to be cautious. He was reading it correctly. He just didn't have what I had. Rourke made the call, hold position, wait for the structural engineer. ETA from the city's emergency structural unit, 40 minutes. 40 minutes is a long time when you can hear people talking through a grate. I walked the perimeter of the collapse point. Slowly. I crouched at the northeast corner and put my hand on the concrete at grade level and felt for vibration. I moved to the west side and did the same. I found a section of exposed rebar at the edge of the damaged zone and bent it slightly between my hands, not enough to stress it, just enough to feel its tension. I know what a stable load transfer feels like when I'm holding the structure that's carrying it, and I know what a compromised one feels like. The difference is a kind of hum. One sound settled. The other sounds like it's still deciding. This one was settled. The secondary shear risk Briscoe had identified was real, but it was on the west face, not the northeast. The northeast corner, the one everyone was looking at as the problem, was actually the most stable entry point, because the pancake fold had created a compression lock on that side. The slab wasn't going to drop further from the northeast. It had already found its resting place. The west wall was the one to leave alone. I went back to Rourke. He was on the radio, and he looked at me the way incident commanders look at civilians who approach them during an active scene. Polite. Firm. Tired of people who don't understand what they're dealing with. I told him I was the electrical contractor. I told him I'd read the structural drawings the day before and I'd just walk the perimeter. I told him the northeast entry was stable, the compression lock on the lower slab was carrying the load, the secondary shear concern was on the west face, and if his team entered from the northeast at grade with a low approach, they had a clean corridor to the void. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, respectfully, that he had a structural engineer coming and he was going to wait for a professional assessment. I didn't argue. I understood why he said it. He didn't know me. He was looking at a man in a work shirt with conduit dust on his hands and a tool bag over his shoulder. He was an incident commander with 20 years of experience and 4 dead engineers on his conscience from a job 8 years ago, something I could read in the way he held his jaw when he said the word professional. He wasn't dismissing me out of arrogance. He was being careful. I respected it. I went back to the grate and crouched down. I could hear Margot Hale's voice more clearly now. She was talking to the other 2, keeping them steady. Telling Keely to stay flat and breathe slowly. She had a fractured wrist, I could tell by the way her voice caught slightly every few minutes, the controlled quality of it, the breath she was managing. The voice of someone holding pain at arm's length so the people around her don't have to feel it. I've heard that voice before too, in other places. I went back to Rourke. I told him I'd go in myself, on a safety line, and I'd have them out before his structural engineer arrived. He started to object. I asked him to give me 30 seconds before he did. I told him I spent 23 years as a pararescueman with the United States Air Force. That I'd gone into 41 personnel recoveries in my career, collapsed structures, crash sites, combat extraction under fire, caves in 3 different mountain ranges. I told him the methodology I'd used to read the northeast entry point was the same one I'd used in a blown schoolhouse in eastern Afghanistan in 2009, and that building had been in worse shape than this one, and everyone I went in for came out. I told him I was 48 years old and I worked electrical jobs now because I have a 7-year-old daughter at home named June who needs her father to be somewhere that isn't a combat zone, and I wasn't going to get myself killed in a basement 2 blocks from where she goes to school. Rourke was quiet for a long moment. He looked at Briscoe. Briscoe looked at the building. Something passed between them. Rourke said, "Safety line, radio contact every 90 seconds, you abort at the first sign of movement." I said yes to all of it. Briscoe handed me a harness and a radio. One of the younger crew members, couldn't have been more than 25, helped me clip in without being asked, and I appreciated that. I went in from the northeast corner at grade, low and flat, the way you enter a space that doesn't fully belong to you yet. The corridor was tighter than I would have liked, maybe 30 inches of clearance at the narrowest point, but it was clean. No groan. No vibration underfoot. The compression lock held exactly the way I'd expected. I found Keely first, because she was closest to the entry point. She was conscious, a gash on her forearm, scared in the clean and honest way that people are scared when something real has happened to them and they've decided to hold themselves together anyway. I told her my name. I told her we were going out the northeast corner and it was going to be tight and she was going to be fine. She nodded. We moved. I brought her to the entry point, passed her into Briscoe's hands, and went back in. Tran was 15 feet further in, on his side with a bruised shoulder and the look of a man running calculations. He asked me, while I was helping him move, whether the western wall section was stable. I told him it wasn't, and that we were going the other direction. He said that's what he'd figured. He'd been keeping them away from it. I brought him out. Went back in for the 3rd time. Margot Hale was at the far end of the void, seated against a server rack that had partially shielded her from the initial collapse. Her left wrist was held against her chest. She looked at me when I came through the debris field, and she had the eyes of someone who has been running on nerve and will for the last 40 minutes and is very close to the end of both. She told me Keely and Tran were out. I told her they were. She said good, and started to move. She wouldn't let me carry her at first. She insisted on moving herself until a piece of concrete shifted under her foot and her wrist took an inadvertent impact and she made one sound, sharp, involuntary, and then stopped insisting. I got her arm across my shoulders and we moved. 23 minutes from the time I clipped the harness to the time I stepped back into the light with Margot Hale's weight against my side. Briscoe had a gurney waiting. 2 paramedics came in immediately. I stepped back and unclipped the harness and handed the radio to the young crew member who'd helped me suit up. I didn't notice the fire marshal until he spoke. He was standing 6 feet away, a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s named Aldridge, and he was looking at me with an expression I recognized. It's the expression of someone who has just watched something they've seen before, somewhere far from here. He asked me what recovery index one used to read the northeast entry point. I told him. He was quiet. Then he said he'd served 2 tours embedded with the 38th Rescue Squadron out of Moody, 2006 to 2009. He'd watched PJs work a collapsed forward operating base after a rocket strike on the perimeter. He said the way they moved through a structure was unlike anything he'd seen before or since. He pulled out his phone and made one call. I heard him give my name to whoever was on the other end. 3 minutes later, he looked up from the phone and looked at me, and whatever he'd heard, it answered the question behind his eyes. He said, 41. I said yes. He nodded slowly. He said that was more than he knew of any man working electrical in this city. Across the scene, on the gurney, Margot Hale had been looking in our direction. She'd had her wrist wrapped in a foil blanket around her shoulders, and her operations director was at her side, and Keeley was sitting upright on a second gurney eating something from a paramedic's kit. The CEO watched me for a moment. I didn't have anything particular to offer. I gave her a small nod, the kind that means everyone's all right and that's the whole point. She said something to the paramedic, and the paramedic looked over at me, and then she said it louder so I could hear it. She said, "Your wiring job. Is it going to be done by Thursday?" I thought about that. I told her I'd lost about 2 hours today, but I'd make it up. She looked at me for another moment. The kind of look that has a lot of things running behind it that a person in a foil blanket on a gurney after 40 minutes in a collapsed basement isn't going to say out loud. She said, "Thursday is fine." Aldridge was still standing beside me. He asked if I had a card. I told him I didn't carry them. I told him I had a daughter who got out of school at 3:15 and I needed to make a call before she got home and heard anything about the building on the radio. He said he understood. I walked back to the north sidewalk where the signal was better, and I took my phone out of my work shirt pocket, and I called June's school and asked them to let her know that her dad was fine and he'd be there at 3:15. The woman at the front desk asked if everything was okay. I told her it was. I told her it had been a straightforward morning. Then I went back inside to finish the 3rd floor.